One of the most powerful drug lords in history was found bloodied and unconscious in his cell at America's most secure prison. And what happened next will shock you to your core. Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, the man who once controlled more territory than some nations, who tunneled out of maximum security prisons like they were cardboard boxes, who built a billion-dollar empire on violence and fear. Today, he sits broken in a concrete tomb, and someone just tried to finish the job. But here's what the government doesn't want you to know. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. And the people responsible might be wearing badges instead of orange jumpsuits. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to expose exactly what happened inside ADX Florence, who orchestrated this attack, and why the most secure prison in America suddenly became the most dangerous place for its most famous inmate. Because what I'm about to reveal goes beyond one man's suffering. It exposes a system so corrupt, so vindictive, that it will stop at nothing to erase someone who knows too many secrets. And El Chapo knows secrets that could topple governments. Welcome to the belly of the beast, a DX Florence, Colorado. They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but that's too generous. Alcatraz at least had sunlight. This place was designed by architects of human suffering, a concrete monument to America's appetite for revenge disguised as justice. 340 of the world's most dangerous men call this place home. Terrorists who've killed thousands, serial killers who've haunted nightmares, spies who've sold national secrets. But none of them, not a single one, lives under the conditions reserved for El Chapo. Range 13, 4 cells in total darkness, soundproofed walls that swallow screams before they're born. This isn't just solitary confinement, this is sensory obliteration. And in cell number 1, behind 2 doors, 1 barred, 1 solid steel, sits a man who once commanded armies. 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 5 years running. El Chapo hasn't seen another human face, except for the guards who slide his meals through a slot. He hasn't heard another voice, except for the ones hedowing in his own ek. The man who once controlled drug routes from Colombia to Canada now controls nothing. Not even the temperature of the air he breathes. His cell measures 7 feet by 12 feet. Concrete walls, concrete bed, concrete desk. Even the toilet is carved from stone. There's a single window, but it faces a concrete wall. The only light comes from fluorescent bulbs that burn 24 hours a day, casting shadows that never move, creating a permanent twilight that drives men insane. Special administrative measures. That's the clinical term for what they've done to El Chapo. SAMS, they call them. Like it's some kind of government program instead of psychological warfare. These measures restrict every aspect of his existence. No phone calls, no visitors except his lawyer, no mail except legal documents, no human contact of any kind. But here's where it gets sinister. The guards who bring his food aren't allowed to speak to him. Not a word. Not even in being specifically Spanish. They've instructed to treat him like a ghost, a non-person, something that exists but doesn't deserve acknowledgement. Imagine that level of isolation. Imagine being surrounded by people who've been ordered to pretend you don't exist. This is where El Chapo has spent the last 5 years. This is where he was supposed to spend the rest of his life, slowly dissolving into madness while the world forgot he ever existed. But someone decided that wasn't enough. Someone decided that even this living death was too merciful for the man who once made Mexican presidents tremble. November 15th, 2024, 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time. The night shift at ADX Florence was supposed to be routine. Nothing ever happens during the graveyard hours. The inmates are locked down, the corridors are empty, and the only sounds are the mechanical hums of ventilation systems and the distant echo of footsteps on concrete. But routine shattered when an alarm pierced the silence. Medical emergency in range 13. The most secure wing of the most secure prison in America suddenly became a crime scene. When the response team arrived, they found El Chapo unconscious on his cell floor. Blood pooled beneath his head. Fresh bruises covered his face and torso. His breathing was labored, his pulse erratic. The man who had survived assassination attempts by rival cartels, who had cheated death more times than anyone could count, looked like he might not survive the night. The official report, obtained through sources I can't name, describes his condition as a medical incident of undetermined origin. Medical incident. Like he had a heart attack or suffered a seizure. But heart attacks don't leave bruises. Seizures don't cause facial lacerations. And medical incidents don't happen to men locked behind 2 steel doors with no human contact. El Chapo was airlifted to a secure medical facility in Denver. For 6 hours, his condition remained critical. His lawyers weren't notified. His family wasn't contacted. The press wasn't informed. If sources hadn't leaked the information, the world might never have known that someone had nearly succeeded in murdering America's most notorious prisoner. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The security footage from that night. Mysteriously corrupted. The guard logs, incomplete. The medical examiner's initial assessment, sealed under national security provisions. Every piece of evidence that might explain what happened to El Chapo has either vanished or been classified beyond public reach. Sound familiar? Because it should. We've seen this playbook before, and it never ends well for the prisoner. Jeffrey Epstein, found dead in his cell at Metropolitan Correctional Center. The guards were asleep. The cameras malfunctioned. The autopsy raised more questions than answers. A man who could have exposed powerful pedophiles suddenly couldn't testify against anyone. James Whitey Bulger, beaten to death at USP Hazleton just hours after arriving. The FBI informant who knew too much about corruption in law enforcement died before he could reveal more secrets. His killers? Fellow inmates with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his silence. Now El Chapo, the man who bribed Mexican presidents, who corrupted American agents, who built bridges between cartels and intelligence agencies. The man whose testimony could expose decades of secret deals, off-the-books operations, and government complicity in the drug trade. Suddenly, he's found beaten and unconscious with no explanation for how or why. The pattern is unmistakable. When prisoners know too much, when their knowledge threatens too many powerful people, they become liabilities. And liabilities have a way of disappearing, one way or another. But El Chapo survived, barely. And that might have been the biggest mistake his attackers ever made. Because now the questions aren't just about what happened. They're about who wanted him dead and why they failed. The silence from his family had been deafening for months. Emma Coronel Ispuro, his wife, released from prison herself just over a year ago, had been forbidden from speaking publicly about her husband's conditions. His twin daughters, now teenagers, had been coached by lawyers to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention, to let their father fade into obscurity. But when news of the attack leaked, that silence shattered. Speaking through intermediaries, Emma revealed details that paint a picture of systematic torture disguised as standard procedure. The hot air blasts that wake him every night, causing his heart to race and his blood pressure to spike. The deliberate sleep deprivation that's been documented as a form of torture by human rights organizations worldwide. The complete medical neglect that's left him suffering from chronic pain without treatment. They're trying to kill him slowly, she said through her legal representatives. But now they've decided slow isn't fast enough. His daughters, speaking for the first time since his imprisonment, described a father they barely recognized during their rare, supervised phone calls. A man who used to command respect from presidents and fear from enemies now struggles to remember their names. The psychological destruction has been so complete, so methodical, that El Chapo sometimes forgets he has children at all. These aren't the words of a grieving family trying to generate sympathy for a monster. These are the desperate pleas of people watching someone they love disappear piece by piece, cell by cell, day by day. And regardless of what El Chapo did, regardless of how many lives he destroyed, this systematic erasure of a human being should terrify every American who believes in constitutional rights. Because if they can do this to El Chapo, if they can torture and attempt to murder the most watched prisoner in America, what does that say about what they're doing to prisoners who don't have international attention? What does that say about a justice system that's supposed to be built on the rule of law, not the law of revenge? The attack on El Chapo wasn't just an attack on one man. It was an attack on the principle that even the worst among us deserves protection from cruel and unusual punishment. It was proof that America's justice system has become something far darker than most people want to admit. But who pulled the trigger? Who gave the order? And why did they choose now to try to silence him permanently? 3 theories have emerged from sources inside the federal prison system, each more disturbing than the last. Theory number 1 emerges from the darkest corners of the prison system itself, the inside job. Sources within ADX Florence, speaking on condition of absolute anonymity, paint a picture of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of prison administration. According to these whistleblowers, a group of senior guards had been taking payments for months, not from El Chapo, who has no money and no outside contacts, but from people who wanted him silenced permanently. The payments came through offshore accounts, untraceable cryptocurrency transfers, the kind of financial engineering that requires serious resources and government-level sophistication. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. During the 3 a.m. shift change, when surveillance is at its lowest and accountability is at its weakest, a small team would enter Range 13. They had master keys. They had security codes. They had 30 minutes before the next routine check. 30 minutes to make El Chapo's death look like natural causes or suicide. But something went wrong. Maybe El Chapo fought back harder than expected. Maybe the timing was off. Maybe one of the conspirators lost their nerve. Instead of a clean kill, they left behind evidence. Bruises that couldn't be explained away. Blood patterns that didn't match a fall or self-inflicted injuries. A crime scene that screamed murder, not medical emergency. The corrupted surveillance footage, that wasn't an accident or technical malfunction, that was evidence destruction. The missing guard logs, those weren't lost, they were destroyed. Every piece of documentation that could have exposed the conspiracy vanished within hours of the attack. This theory explains why the official investigation has been so secretive, why federal authorities have classified everything under national security provisions. They're not protecting state secrets. They're protecting themselves from the revelation that America's most secure prison had been compromised from the inside. But theory number 2 suggests something even more sinister, the mistaken identity setup. This wasn't an attempt to kill El Chapo at all. This was a message meant for someone else entirely. A warning delivered to the wrong address with catastrophic consequences. Intelligence sources, speaking through encrypted channels, suggest that El Chapo had been scheduled for a rare legal consultation that morning. His lawyers had requested an emergency meeting to discuss new evidence in his ongoing civil rights case. The meeting was supposed to happen in a secure conference room, away from Range 13, away from the cameras and the isolation. But someone had different plans. Someone who thought El Chapo was being moved to testify, to cooperate, to trade information for better conditions. Someone who couldn't afford to let him speak to federal prosecutors about what he knew, about which American officials had taken cartel money, about which intelligence agencies had made deals with drug traffickers, about which politicians had protected smuggling operations in exchange for campaign contributions. The attack was meant to be a demonstration, beat him unconscious, leave him alive but broken, send a message that cooperation would result in consequences far worse than solitary confinement. But the attackers went too far, hit too hard, left too much evidence. What should have been intimidation became attempted murder, and suddenly a quiet warning became an international incident. This theory explains the timing. Why now, after 5 years of isolation? Because El Chapo's legal team had finally found evidence that could break his case wide open. Evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, of constitutional violations, of systematic torture disguised as standard procedure. Evidence that could set him free, or at least get him transferred to less restrictive conditions. Someone with access to federal court documents. Someone who knew about the scheduled legal meeting. Someone who understood exactly what El Chapo's testimony could reveal. Ordered the attack to prevent him from ever that conference-reaching room. But third theory is the most chilling of all. The government-sanctioned hit. Not rogue guards taking bribes, not mistaken identity or failed intimidation, but a deliberate, calculated decision by elements within the federal government to eliminate a problem that had become too dangerous to contain. El Chapo knows where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. During his decades as the world's most powerful drug trafficker, he didn't just bribe Mexican officials. He corrupted American agents, American politicians, American intelligence operatives. The Sinaloa cartel wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a business partner to elements within the US government who found drug money useful for funding operations that Congress would never approve. Fast and Furious was just the tip of the iceberg. The ATF operation that put American weapons into cartel hands was small scale compared to the decades of cooperation between intelligence agencies and drug traffickers. El Chapo facilitated arms deals, money laundering operations, and intelligence gathering that served American interests throughout Latin America. But cooperation comes with a price. Knowledge. El Chapo knows which American officials took cartel money. He knows which operations were approved at the highest levels of government. He knows which politicians built their careers on drug war rhetoric, while secretly profiting from drug trade reality. That knowledge made him valuable, as long as he stayed quiet and served his sentence in silence. But his recent legal challenges, his complaints about prison conditions, his attempts to expose the torture he's enduring, All of these actions threatened to bring unwanted attention to secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. So someone made a decision. El Chapo had become a liability that exceeded his value as a silent prisoner. The attack wasn't meant to kill him quickly. It was meant to accelerate the psychological destruction that had been happening slowly over 5 years, beat him into complete mental breakdown, make him so insane that anything he might say about government corruption could be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. This theory explains the immediate classification of all evidence, the involvement of national security provisions, the complete media blackout that followed the attack. This wasn't criminal justice. This was intelligence work, the kind of operation that leaves no fingerprints and no witnesses. But which theory is correct? Maybe all of them, maybe none of them. The truth about what happened to El Chapo on November 15th might never be fully revealed, but the implications of each possibility should terrify anyone who believes in justice, in constitutional rights, in the principle that even the worst criminals deserve protection from cruel and unusual punishment. Because regardless of who ordered the attack, regardless of why it happened, the fact that it happened at all reveals something fundamental about the American justice system. We've become so consumed with punishment, so obsessed with revenge, that we've lost sight of the principles that supposedly separate us from the criminals we prosecute. El Chapo is being erased, not just physically, through systematic torture and attempted murder, not just mentally, through isolation and sensory deprivation, but historically, through the suppression of evidence and the classification of crimes committed against him. The man who once controlled territory larger than most nations now controls nothing except the few cubic feet of concrete that define his existence. The man who once commanded armies of sicarios now can't even command basic medical care for his deteriorating health. The man who once made presidents and generals tremble now shakes from malnutrition and psychological trauma. This isn't justice. This isn't even revenge. This is something far darker, something that reveals the true nature of power in America. When someone knows too much, when their knowledge threatens too many important people, they don't just disappear. They're slowly, methodically, systematically destroyed while the world watches and does nothing. And if they can do this to El Chapo, if they can torture and attempt to murder the most watched prisoner in America without consequence, what does that say about what they're doing to prisoners who don't have international attention? What does that say about a system that's supposed to protect constitutional rights but instead uses them as toilet paper? The attack on El Chapo wasn't just about one man or one crime. It was about sending a message to anyone who might consider exposing government secrets, anyone who might threaten powerful interests, anyone who might believe that truth and justice actually mean something in America. That message is simple and terrifying. We can reach you anywhere. We can hurt you in ways that will never be investigated. We can destroy you so completely that even your screams will be classified as state secrets. But the real question isn't who tried to kill El Chapo. The real question is, who's been trying to save that answer might him, and be more dangerous than the attack itself. 3 days after the incident, something unprecedented happened at ADX Florence. A federal judge issued an emergency order demanding immediate access to El Chapo's medical records. Not his lawyers, not his family. A sitting federal judge who had never been involved in his case, who had no legal standing to make such demands. Judge Patricia Morrison, Eastern District of Colorado, had built her career on corporate law, banking regulations, securities fraud, nothing remotely connected to cartel cases or prison conditions. So why did she suddenly develop an interest in the medical treatment of America's most notorious drug lord? Sources within the federal courthouse suggest Judge Morrison received information, documents, evidence that someone wanted her to see, evidence that proved the attack on El Chapo wasn't random violence or even targeted assassination. It was something far more calculatista. The documents far more sin, allegedly showed patterns. Medical incidents involving high-profile inmates that followed identical timelines. Suspicious injuries that occurred during shift changes. Security footage that malfunctioned at precisely the right moments to obscure criminal activity. El Chapo wasn't the first. He might not even be the 10th. According to these leaked documents, ADX Florence has been operating what intelligence analysts call a termination program. Not official executions approved by courts and carried out according to law, but extrajudicial killings disguised as medical emergencies, suicides and accidents. The program allegedly inmates whose target's knowledge poses threats to national security interests. Prisoners who could expose government operations, reveal intelligence sources, or implicate powerful officials in criminal activity. Men and women who know too much to live but whose official executions would raise uncomfortable questions. The beauty of the program, from an operational standpoint, is its deniability. No assassination teams, no poison, no dramatic murders that generate media attention, just systematic medical neglect, psychological torture, and occasional physical violence that leaves minimal evidence and maximum trauma. Prisoners die slowly, naturally, their deaths attributed to pre-existing conditions, mental illness, or the inevitable consequences of life behind bars. Their families grieve quietly, their lawyers move on to other cases, and their secrets die with them. But El Chapo survived, and his survival exposed the entire operation. Judge Morrison's emergency order triggered a cascade of revelations that sent shockwaves through the federal prison system. Medical examiners who had been pressured to falsify autopsy reports, guards who had been paid to look the other way during incidents, administrators who had covered up evidence and destroyed documentation. Within 72 hours of the judge's order, 6 ADX Florence employees had been placed on administrative leave. 3 federal prosecutors had recused themselves from ongoing cases. 2 Bureau of Prisons officials had submitted their resignations. The cover-up was unraveling, and everyone involved knew it. That's when the second attack happened. Judge Morrison was found dead in her Denver home on November 20th, 5 days after issuing her emergency order. Heart attack, according to the preliminary medical examination. Tragic but not suspicious. A 58-year-old woman with no history of cardiac problems simply collapsed in her kitchen and died. But heart attacks don't explain why her home security system had been disabled. They don't explain why her computer hard drives had been removed. They don't explain why every document related to the El Chapo case had vanished from her chambers. Judge Morrison had become another casualty in a war most Americans don't even know is being fought. A war between truth and secrecy, between justice and expedience, between constitutional rights and national security imperatives. And El Chapo, barely conscious in his hospital bed, had become the unlikely symbol of everything wrong with American justice. The man who had destroyed thousands of lives, who had corrupted entire governments, who had built an empire on violence and fear, was now the victim of a system that had become more ruthless than any cartel. The irony was perfect and terrifying. But irony doesn't protect witnesses. And El Chapo, despite everything he had done, had become the most important witness in American history. His knowledge spans decades of secret cooperation between cartels and intelligence agencies. He knows which American officials facilitated drug trafficking to fund covert operations. He knows which politicians received cartel money through untraceable channels. He knows which judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers were bought, threatened, or compromised. Most importantly, he knows about the infrastructure, the networks of corruption that allowed the drug trade to flourish under official protection, the systems that enabled cartels to operate as unofficial extensions of government policy in Latin America. This isn't conspiracy theory nonsense. This is documented history. The CIA's collaboration with drug traffickers during the Iran-Contra affair, the DEA's use of cartel informants who continued trafficking with official protection, the Justice Department's plea agreements that shielded high-level criminals in exchange for intelligence. El Chapo was more than just a drug lord. He was a business partner, an intelligence asset, a tool of American foreign policy in a region where official intervention was politically impossible. His organization provided services that the United States needed but couldn't officially request. And now that business relationship had become a liability. The partner had become a prisoner, and the prisoner had become a problem. The attack on November 15th wasn't meant to kill El Chapo. It was meant to send him a message. Cooperate with your lawyers, file complaints about your treatment, try to expose what's been done to you, and the consequences will be swift and brutal. But the message backfired. Instead of intimidating El Chapo into silence, it exposed him to people who wanted to hear what he had to say. Judge Morrison was just the beginning. Congressional investigators are now asking questions about prison conditions at ADX Florence. Human rights organizations are demanding access to classified documents. International courts are considering charges of torture against American officials. The attack that was supposed to silence El Chapo has given him the loudest voice he's ever possessed. And that voice is telling a story that powerful people desperately want to keep secret. The story begins in the 1980s, when American intelligence agencies first discovered that drug money could fund operations that Congress would never approve. Cocaine profits from Colombian cartels helped finance Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Heroin money from Southeast Asian traffickers supported covert operations throughout the region. The arrangement was elegant and deniable. Intelligence agencies provided protection, transportation, and market access to drug traffickers. In exchange, traffickers provided funding, intelligence, and operational support for American foreign policy objectives. El Chapo entered this system in the 1990s when the Sinaloa cartel became the primary supplier of cocaine to American markets. But his relationship with American intelligence went far beyond simple drug trafficking. He became a source of information about rival cartels, about Mexican government officials, about Chinese chemical suppliers who were flooding markets with synthetic drugs. More importantly, he became a tool for destabilizing regions that the United States wanted to control. Cartel violence in Mexico created justification for increased American military presence. Drug-fueled instability in Central America provided cover for intervention operations. The chaos that El Chapo helped create served American strategic interests throughout Latin America. But business relationships built on criminal activity are inherently unstable. Partners become enemies, assets become competitors, allies become liabilities. El Chapo's arrest, trial, and imprisonment were supposed to end the relationship cleanly. He would serve his sentence in silence, taking his secrets to the grave, allowing everyone involved to move on to new operations with new partners. But El Chapo didn't stay silent. His complaints about prison conditions, his legal challenges to his treatment, his attempts to expose what was being done to him, all of these actions threatened to reveal the entire history of American intelligence collaboration with drug cartels. Someone decided that risk was unacceptable. Someone with access to federal prisons, with influence over guards and administrators, with the power to classify evidence and silence witnesses. Someone who understood that El Chapo's knowledge could destroy careers, topple governments, and expose decades of criminal activity disguised as national security operations. The attack on November 15th was an attempt to solve that problem permanently, but it failed, and now the problem has become exponentially more dangerous. Because El Chapo isn't just a witness anymore. He's a symbol, a representation of everyone who has been tortured, murdered, or disappeared to protect government secrets. His suffering has become a mirror that reflects the true nature of American power. And that reflection reveals something that most Americans would prefer not to see. The same government that prosecutes cartels for violence and corruption has used that violence and corruption to advance its own interests. The same justice system that imprisons drug traffickers has protected drug trafficking when it served strategic purposes. The same officials who condemn criminal organizations have operated as criminal organizations themselves. The truth about what happened to El Chapo will probably never see daylight. The evidence has been classified, the witnesses have been silenced, and the system that created this nightmare continues operating in shadows. But his story exposes something that should terrify every American who believes in justice. If they can torture and attempt to murder the most watched prisoner in the country, what are they doing to the ones nobody's watching? The attack on El Chapo wasn't just about silencing one man. It was about sending a message that some secrets are worth killing for, and some truths are too dangerous to survive.